My name is Doug Riley, and I am the director of the A.J. Reed Science Discovery Center, which is our on-campus, hands-on science museum that has been closed for a long time as a physical space, but has remained open as a virtual purveyor of programs. One of those programs is tonight's webinar, which is the third and final webinar of our OutSMARTing the Pandemic series. Sally Hahn from the anthropology department is my partner in crime in creating this series, and I want to thank Sally for all her work on that this semester. It's been a really fun project, and we've had two really wonderful webinars, and I fully expect that tonight will be wonderful as well. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to Sally to introduce our speakers for tonight. But first, just a few housekeeping items. If you would like if you are a student and you would like lead credit for being here tonight, I have a link which I will put into the chat. It is a very long link, so you'll need to copy it over unless you have a photographic memory. And get ready for it. There it is. That is a very, very long link. And apparently, if you click that link, you will magically get lead credit for being here tonight. Second, we'd ask that you mute yourself during tonight's presentation. When we have time for questions, you can post your question in the chat, or if you want, you can unmute and just ask like you would in a live in-person event, if you remember what those are like. We always start off our OutSMARTing the Pandemic webinars with some public service announcements, and we will do that tonight as well. And we'll start with some resources, which I will also put in the chat. I'll put two things there. One is our own campus's COVID or the counseling center's COVID-19 resource page, and then a page of resources from New York Project Hope, which offers free and confidential help if you are experiencing any mental health stress or crisis. This has been an extraordinarily hard year. I know that when we marked the 1 year anniversary of us all going into lockdown and everything changing, that hit me much harder than New Year's did. And in addition to like all the anxiety that I've cultivated over the pandemic, there was also just like a real feeling of kind of exhaustion. You know, mental health hygiene is a real thing. Today is a wellness day, and so we hope that everybody at least did one thing today that made them feel good and contributed to better mental health hygiene. I took a bike ride, and that felt great, although it was a lot hotter than I thought. And my last public service announcement is we are hopefully closing in on the end of this pandemic, or at least a new phase, a better phase, as vaccines roll out, and hopefully we can do more things. But I just want to remind everybody that on campus, we still have a policy where if you're on campus, you have to have a face mask on. We just want to remind people that that is not just a rule, but it's also a really, really important way that we can fight the pandemic, even with the vaccines. Even if some of us are vaccinated, it's still really important that we wear masks. They are still one of the most important tools we have in controlling and fighting this pandemic. You know, it's getting hot. I know that it gets sweaty. You know, I shaved my beard nice and trim because I didn't want all that heat all up in my face there. And you know, but think of it this way, it is how we tell each other that we care. Okay, every person wearing a mask is saying to everybody else, I care about you. And if you understand the way masks really work, that's very, very true, because although we tend to think of them as protection for ourselves, that's not really why they're so effective. It's actually to prevent us from infecting other people. So masks do much better at preventing the disease from getting out than they do from the disease getting in. So so they really are an outward expression of our care for the community. So I just want to encourage everybody, your masks are beautiful, and we want to see them. And so, you know, get a funky colored mask or a Batman mask or whatever it is that you want to wear, and show us what you have. Lastly, before I turn it over to Sally here, there are 3 upcoming events that the Science Discovery Center is sponsoring, and I am obliged to plug all of them. And they start tomorrow night. I'm going to put all of them in the chat right now. The nice thing about what I'm putting in the chat is that it has all the Zoom links that you need to participate right there, so you don't have to go anywhere else. Tomorrow night, we are having our, look at all that. Tomorrow night, we're having our annual, or the first part of our annual Yuri's Night celebration on April 12th, 1961. Yuri Gagarin, Soviet cosmonaut, was the first person in space, and every year the world throws him a party to celebrate humans becoming a spacefaring species. It's a great time. We're doing a planetarium show tomorrow night. It's a special longer, like hour-and-a-half, 2-hour planetarium show. We're going to do cool science talks as well as science trivia and music trivia. So if you know like space songs, that would be great. You will do good. We're going to give away awesome Yuri's Night t-shirts. Yuri's Night is just really fun. We usually do it at Roots Brewing Company, and it's like an in-person event, but we're going to have an awesome virtual event. And then on Monday, the second part of our Yuri's Night celebration, these are both at 7 p.m., is really, really cool. We are working with a Minneapolis-based theater group called Math Theater. It's a pair, and they are going to be joining us, and they are going to be in character. We have Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Caroline Herschel, 3 famous astronomers, and they are going to be presenting some of their research. Not unlike some of our presenters are going to be presenting research tonight, but they're doing it from the grave and deep in history. And this is a fantastic program for younger kids. So if any of you have families, you are all invited. Please, you can use that Zoom link, 7 p.m. on Monday. Math Theater does a fantastic job. We had them on campus. They did a show about Madame Curie about 1.5 years ago. They're really, really wonderful. And so that should be a lot of fun. And again, it's family focused, so should be good for everybody. And then finally on April 20th, the Science Discovery Center has been doing a multi-year project called the 2041 Project, which is all about imagining a positive climate future, which doesn't mean that we're denying that climate change is happening. We're just trying to think through creative ways of surviving and dealing with that issue, and we're trying to imagine what a better future might look like in that context. And so on the 20th, we're presenting a virtual panel discussion from the year 2041, and we're going to be talking about a pressing issue facing SUNY Oneonta in 20 years. There we have the Zoom link to that in there as well. And so it's a really interesting project. You'll be invited and encouraged to create your own 2041 character, and you can participate in the panel as a fictional character. You could be a student in the year 2041 or a faculty member. You can be whatever you want. And it's a lot of fun. We've been doing workshops this semester on this topic, and that has led to this panel. So those are our 3 upcoming programs. I will be quiet now and let our evening proceed. So I'll turn it over to Sally to introduce our speakers.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to introduce each set of presenters as we go along. So it's my pleasure right now to introduce 2 members of the SUNY Oneonta Theater Department. Scott Segar is Technical Director, Production Manager, and Theatrical Designer. Matt Grenier is Assistant Technical Director, Theatrical Designer. You might have seen and enjoyed their work in plays and performances at the Goodrich Theater, which I look forward to attending again, hopefully sooner than later. Last spring, they took their expertise in theater and the actual physical space where they typically work on their projects, and put that to a new use, producing personal protective equipment during a time of shortage. So it's we're turning to them to hear about what they have to tell us about that project, and really thinking through this way of taking these creative abilities and talents and pushing them in another direction. So Scott and Matt, please take it away.
Thank you, Sally. Matt, why don't you go? We're going to show you some pictures of what we are doing so you don't have to be staring at our faces the whole time.
Should be able to see our screen now.
Yep, I can see it. So the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of set the stage and kind of give a little brief history of how we got to, the place, where what you see is going on, where we essentially became kind of a little factory for PPE, our own little SUNY sweatshop. Shortly after the kind of the shock of, the school shutting down and everything kind of going haywire, and the realization that things were not going to be normal, and they weren't going to be normal for a while, and kind of at the same time watching things deteriorate, particularly in New York City, and hearing about all these shortages of basic necessity safety equipment. I think Matt and I both kind of had the thought that we ought to be able to do something. And so the first thing that kind of happened is we kind of looked around the space. It's like, all right, well, what have we got that we can live without for a while, and we could just send it off to whoever needs it? And, first thing that went were some of our safety glasses and some face shields. And we just kind of collected stuff that we thought we could live without, or replace fairly easily when supplies were back in store, and we just sent those out. And the next thing that happened, Matt, you might want to go ahead and skip ahead two slides, is we were in the middle of building a show, Once Upon a Mattress. So we had materials in process that we were using, and so we were building these fabric covered flats, pieces of scenery, and there was a lot of offcuts. So we had a whole lot of scrap fabric left over. So kind of the next easy leap was, well, we can turn these into masks. And that's actually something Matt did a lot of from home while we were in our initial lockdown. I've never learned to sew. He clearly was able to pick that up and process with that better than I was. And kind of along the same time, we were individually starting to tap into forums online on Facebook and other areas. And there were a lot of other groups also trying to figure out what they could do. And I know Matt particularly got in touch with people who were using 3D printers. And there were a whole lot of different designs and files that were being shared around. So we also have a 3D printer. And so that's also another thing that started to we started to kind of slowly produce early on. And as we're making these individual contributions, we also started to tap into other people around campus. There's a picture of Alan there, who works over in the sciences. I believe he and Doug were communicating about some of this 3D printing, and I know Doug was making masks in that time as well. So we kind of got started as individuals, but through these various forums, realized that there were a bunch of us on campus who were all working towards the same goals. And I think Doug, it was really the one who kind of reached out to a lot of us and said, hey, maybe we should all get together and coordinate, figure out what the greatest needs are, what needs to be made, where we can send it, and pool our resources and see if we can't create some efficiencies there, which is where the SUNY Oneonta volunteers creating PPE grew out of. And kind of my contribution to that was I was approached on, I think, one of the local Facebook groups by a local physician who had seen a YouTube video about people making homemade gowns, surgical gowns out of home wrap, that stuff you see before the siding goes on. And she asked me, because she, we go to the same church, she knew I had some skills in doing, being somewhat handy. I create things, I build things. So she approached me and asked if I might be interested in helping contribute to that, to give to the local hospitals. So I agreed, and so I started looking at these videos and started making some of those gowns in my basement, because I had just enough space to do that. Matt, you want to flip over to that? In fact, you can go ahead and, so we've got the house wrap. So that's what I was creating in my basement. And I think if you go back one, we can see the face shields that Matt was working on as a 3D printing endeavor. So these were all kind of individual projects that each of us started on our own, and then it kind of coalesced to that larger group. And we also figured out that, the theater had a great space, nice and open, some place where we could set up a lot of places to work and still be socially distant. We can mask up. We were working closely with Peter Booth, who works over in the health and safety office. And we figured out that we could do this in a safe and sanitary way. So we started figuring out that we could scale this up so that, on our own, we could only create a few of these individual things on our own in a day or two. But if we manage to scale it up and get more people involved and get people to donate materials or money, that we could actually churn out quite a lot of product. And that was a realization probably in like mid-April. And then we really got down to the nitty-gritty of figuring out the logistics of how we could do that, and bringing together more volunteers and these other groups. And Matt really took up the logistics aspect of that from that point forward. He really took the lead on a lot of the logistical aspects in terms of where to send things and coordinating a lot of our volunteer staff. So with that, I will turn this over to Matt.
Cool, thanks. As Scott was just starting to talk about logistics there, one thing you can kind of see from the slide on screen that there are so many different kind of organizations and groups that we were participating with or relying on for information and whatnot. And I don't know, looking back on it now, it's kind of like, it was such a chaotic time. There were so many people trying to, figure out how to do all of these different things safely, what to make, how to make it safely. So what you're seeing on screen right now is just a sampling of some of the groups that we were working with or relying on as a source of information to figure out what to make and how to make it. And Facebook, of course, was kind of also a very, very useful place for a lot of these groups to communicate with each other. So there were a lot of things that came together just through Facebook as well. And if you have any questions about any of these particular groups, you can reach out to us. So to touch back on what Scott was saying about 3D printing, the theater department had bought a 3D printer back the summer before the pandemic, and we had started using it for some of our productions in the fall, and we weren't using it for anything. So I figured we have this 3D printer sitting, just down on campus, not doing anything. We could be putting it to use and printing off something that's needed. And one of the things that was needed early on was, of course, the face shields. And it was just, it was really quite shocking, the number of designs of face shield, face shield supports that people were producing and were being passed around. And everyone was debating the advantages and disadvantages of this design and that design. And we ended up mostly printing the design that you see on screen here, which is called the 3D Verkstand. And it's a very simple flat part that has these 6 notches around the perimeter that allow you to use a standard 3-hole punch to punch a sheet of plastic transparency twice, and then it just pops right around the frame. And then you're able to wear essentially a sheet of transparency as a face shield. One other thing that was very interesting that we got into a little bit as well was trying to print things as fast as you possibly can. It was very important in all of this. You're trying to mass produce things. So you can see on the 3D printer there that there's actually a stack of parts on top of each other. So I was able to run the printer for about 11 hours continuously and have it print 20 parts at a time. And once they came off the printer, you just separate them from each other. And now you've printed 20 parts in a faster, more efficient way. So stacking your parts is a technique that a lot of people were using to print things faster. There was a lot of really interesting things going on in the industry that people were doing just to get things printed quickly. So Scott mentioned the gown making, how we started with the Tyvek house wrap type material initially. They did he did sort of a reverse engineering of an actual medical gown. So they took the gown apart and then sort of copied the pattern so that we could transfer it to Tyvek material and cut it symmetric down the center so it was folded down the middle. And then basically you enclose the arm tubes and tape them down the seams, and then you have 2 enclosed arms, and you can just slide your arms in, put it over your head, and you've got effectively a gown. Scott mentioned how we moved on to setting up an assembly line for our production of gowns. We did sort of a first batch of gowns, and through connections on Facebook, we found a group to send those initial gowns to. And once we had sent them one batch, they were kind of like, hey, do you want to make some more of these? Like, well, I suppose we could set up, some operation that we could do some more of these. So that's kind of what led us to try to actually mass produce. So we were able to set up our stage with lots of extra tables from custodials for maintenance, and really set up an operation to try to turn out as many as we could, which is not a trivial task. I mean, you think it's okay, we're just going to make this same thing over and over again, but we're also managing volunteers, trying to keep everyone safe, having to think about all of the issues with the pandemic of people coming and going. Not to mention you're making something that is potentially being used in medical environments. So you kind of have to worry about, keeping the materials clean and things like that. So yeah, that this was our mass production process. One thing we tried to do was to not waste any material if we could help it. So we took the little offcuts of our sheeting and tried to make some scrub caps out of it. One thing we're doing in theater all the time is trying not to waste material, take advantage of as much of the materials that we have as we can. So this is just a look at the caps that we figured out how to make to use up some of that material. And then we also went through and we ended up changing to a plastic gown instead of the home wrap, because through our consultation with groups like the Open Source Medical Supplies, there are home wrap works in an emergency, but there are a lot of kind of issues with it. It's inflexible and it's kind of noisy when you're trying to wear it and that sort of thing. So we switched to plastic, which is just lighter, easier to wear. Easier to wear for a long period of time, easier to remove, So we switched over to making our gowns out of plastic. And one of the things about forming the arms with plastic is that it's best to do it with heat. So in the top right corner there, you see that we're using a heat gun like you would use to strip paint in your house. We're using that to cause the plastic to melt and to seam together, essentially, kind of like you would seal, vacuum bags at home or something. So that was a technique that we found that worked well for sealing the arms up on the plastic gowns. And we did actually produce a document showing how our whole operation worked that we shared with the community. And if anyone is interested in that, you can shoot us an email and we'd be happy to share that with you if you'd like to see sort of the whole intricacies of step by step how the gowns were made. And then the last part of this mass production effort was that we were using some of our volunteers to make masks for the campus community as well, which unfortunately turned out to be not quite as critical because of the beginning of last semester. But to date, I believe they have sewn over 600 masks at this point in our costume shop, and that's been coordinated by our costume shop supervisor, Margene McCaslin-Doyle. And I'll end here just by giving a quick shout out to all of our volunteers that came in and helped us with this process. Scott and I could only do so much, and I would estimate probably had maybe 25 or 30 unique individuals coming in and helping us build things on the stage and in the costume shop. So they were really, instrumental to making what we made, as well as the Science Discovery Center and the foundation. We certainly could not have done anything that we did without their support as well. And the result is that we made probably about 2,300 face shield frames, almost 1,600 medical gowns, 1,400 scrub caps, and to date we've sewn about 800 masks. And these are some pictures that we got back from some of the actual healthcare workers in various hospitals, clinics, assisted living facilities, rehab centers. We also sent to other PPE distributors, and most of what we sent, we sent to New York, but we also sent to other states as well, like New Jersey, California, Florida, and Texas. So this was just kind of a really cool thing to get this feedback from people, seeing that that the things that we were making were actually, doing some good and being of help to somebody. So. And that's all we have about our PPE project. Hopefully we can take some questions later.
Wow, thank you. And in case you didn't see in the chat, Doug wrote, I wonder how many lives were saved thanks to that PPE. And yeah, I mean, I love seeing that photo of the healthcare providers actually wearing, I mean, I don't know, it just got me all like, it's very emotional.
Yeah, I think the first time we got a picture back like that, it was kind of emotional. It was like, wow, something we made is in an emergency room somewhere right now being used,
Yeah, that's a big deal. So yes, there will be time for questions at the end. So so save those questions for later. All right, so we'll move on to our next presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter. Dr. Amy Dowdy is Professor of English at SUNY Oneonta. She's a former department chair and a recipient of the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2019. Dr. Dowdy has published papers looking at works of children's and young adult YA literature, including, I have to name them because I love this. She's written about Junie B. Jones, Harry Potter, and Artemis Fowl, among others. I'm very excited to hear what she has to tell us about pandemics in children's and YA fiction. So, Amy, take it away. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, I just realized that. Sorry about that. Let me try this again. Boy, you'd think I would know how to do this by now. Where is my screen one? All right, did that work?
You're good.
I'm good? Okay. I couldn't tell because there was no response. All right, so here we go. This is quite different from what you just heard, just bear that in mind. So whenever I teach Lit 306, which is my primary children's lit course, the first reading I assign is Natalie Babbitt's 1970 article, Happy Endings, of course, and also joy. In this article, Babbitt, the author of the children's book Tuck Everlasting, systematically deconstructs many of the assumptions about children's literature that place it in a lesser category than adult literature, from the topic to the writing style to the emotional impact and all sorts of other things. The primary difference between adult literature and children's literature, she argues, is the ending. The happy ending of children's literature is not the kind of, quote, kind of contrived final sugarcoating that seems tacked on primarily to spare the child any glimpse of what really would have happened had the author not been vigilant. Instead, the happy ending goes much deeper, something which turns the story ultimately toward hope rather than resignation. Unlike adult literature, Babbitt argues, children's literature does not contain compromises in its endings. Babbitt was writing before young adult or YA literature had gained traction as a genre. YA literature is actually a very new genre, but her observations about children's literature seem to apply to much of YA literature as well. The YA literature does sometimes contain the compromise notable of adult literature. Given the liminal nature of adolescence, it's not surprising that some compromise may creep into the hopeful endings offered by YA authors, but they're still largely very hopeful. What's notable about pandemic literature, regardless of genre, whether it's children's, YA, adult, historical, speculative, is that it too offers hope. Eve Lynch, in the article In Praise of Pandemic Fiction, explores pandemic fictions from Virgil to Ovid to Boccaccio to Ali Smith, who's an Australian author's 2020 novel Summer, which includes aspects of the coronavirus pandemic as well as the bushfires that were going on in Australia in that year. Lynch notes, quote, when times are fraught, telling a story that holds a mirror up to the real world, even if that world is plagued by a deadly pandemic, is a powerful way of providing hope and solidarity. Bjorn Sundmark, detailing some of the international picture books about the coronavirus pandemic, says, quote, children's literature, like all art and literature, can vent fears and at the same time provide hope and comfort. While children's and YA books about COVID-19 are still emerging, not surprisingly, there is a body of literature about pandemics, both historical and speculative, that has existed for years. What I'm going to do for this talk is just sort of go over some of the books that are available and then talk about how hope is presented in a couple of specific examples of those books. Most of the texts I'll be discussing are YA. I've got a small chunk of children's stuff that I'll reference. Please note that I have not had a chance to read all of the books that I'm listing here. This is a list that I've compiled from various sources online. And I'm going to just go from historical to present to future. So in terms of historical texts, you can see here that we've got everything from Donna Joan Napoli's 13th century England focused book Breath, which is actually a revision of the Pied Piper folktale. Donna Joan Napoli does a lot of folktale revisions. And then, you know, other things about the Black Death and the plague in London and Holland. And then there's a 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic that's covered in Laurie Hall Sanderson's Fever, 1793. And then there's a lot of American stuff and stuff from the 1900s up. So 1900 San Francisco, the bubonic plague. There's also a 1900 story set in Australia, also about the bubonic plague, called All Fall Down. There's a book set in 1906 about typhoid fever called Deadly. And then there are a number of books about the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. The book that I've got pictured in this slide is actually the only nonfiction book that I've there, and it's a graphic book, so it's like a graphic novel except it's nonfiction. And then the last book on this list, as you can see, is set in the Ottawa Valley, and it's set in 1946, and it deals with polio. The book that I want to focus on here is called A Death-Struck Year by Makia Lucier, and it's about the Spanish flu from 1918. It's set in Oregon. It's a first-person narratives, journal style, with the main character Cleo Berry. She sort of slips out of school, which has been quarantined. She's a boarding school student because she wants to be home. and discovers that her brother can't get back from San Francisco and that the housekeeper has the flu, and so she can't come in anyway. And she doesn't know what she wants to do with her life, so she decides, after seeing an ad, to become a Red Cross volunteer. And so that allows Lucia to show the reader a lot of the stuff that's going on. What do these Red Cross volunteers do? How fast does the infection spread? What is Portland, Oregon like right now in this time? How did the soldiers play a role in the spread? You also see that it's a very white world, and one of the things that's notable about a lot of this pandemic fiction, it is very Caucasian. And that's something that's starting to change as a result of what we're seeing with this pandemic, and noting the disparities of ethnicity and race in terms of how people are being struck by the flu or by the pandemic. Anyways, the book sort of ends with the waning of the flu. It's the beginning of 1919 when it ends. And there's sort of looking forward to the future. And so there's this very hopeful outlook, even though if you studied the 1918 epidemic, you know that it extends past 1918 and there's a resurgence, but we don't really see that here. But we do get this hopeful idea that, you know, Cleo's going to do okay, she's going to survive and do well. And so there's this very hopeful tone. And the fact that it's a historical text, and we know that, is helpful as well, because it allows us to see that, in fact, you can get past a pandemic. And so that's one of the reasons I think that the historical fiction is useful for people who are trying to deal with the pandemic now. It's a bibliotherapy type of thing. You also have books that are time travel, so they'll have a past element to them, but they'll also either have a present or a futuristic one. And so some examples here: The Plague Tales is set both in 21st century with a plague there, but there's also going back to Spain in 1348, where there's also plague going on. So you see the dueling plagues. In The House on Hound Hill, it's sort of a haunted house type of thing, where you know, there's the contemporary, or the 1998 contemporary anyways, and then the plague back in 1665 in London. And then The Cure deals with far into the future, so the 25th century, but also the 1348 Germany. And there's some Judaism that gets brought into it as well. The main character gets put into a Jewish person's body. That's what the cure is for his misbehavior. Anyway, so that's sort of the time travel-y stuff. There are a few present time texts that are realistic and or that deal with COVID. So The Heaven Shop by Deborah Ellis deals with AIDS in Malawi. And so that sort of epidemic that's going on there. And so it's looking at the attitudes towards AIDS there. And then this more recent book, which is actually about the COVID lockdown, it's romantic fiction for teens. It's short fiction told by a variety of different YA authors to show that, yes, you can even have romance during the COVID times. Now, in terms of actual children's books, so for young kids, there are a couple of really good resources, and I don't know if our librarians, I know we have a bunch of librarians in here, have seen these, but these are really great. So lifetreebooks.org, which is run by the person who's in charge of IBI, links a bunch of different free downloadable picture books about the coronavirus. They're fiction and nonfiction. Most of them are Chinese in origin. All of them have at least 12 different translations, including English. So you can download those. And then the New York School Library System also created a really, really great guide where you could, if you go into it, you can see picture books from all over the world, as well as some chapter books. And those are all free to read as well. And they include some big names. So like Shannon Hale has her Princess in Black series, and she's written one for the coronavirus that is linked from this site. So it's actually pretty impressive. I will say a lot of these are going to be self-published, because there's not, publishing takes time, and we've only been doing this for a year and a bit, which it seems like longer, but it's not. So anyways, but those are some of the resources that are available for children. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint, by the way, if anybody is curious afterwards. In terms of speculative text, what you see in terms of present time versus futuristic, it's sort of a conflation in some ways. It's hard to tell, is it really supposed to be futuristic? Is it really contemporary? But the ones that I've got listed here seem to me to be reflecting of a current time. So the way we fall looks at a disease that afflicts a particular island community that is then quarantined from the rest of the world. And the main character is as a high school student who's dealing with it. Similarly, pandemic is actually very similar to what we have in terms of the spread of some kind of unexpected disease from the reviews I've read. Again, I've not had a chance to read most of these texts. Quarantine the Loners, which is part of a series, has a disease that kids contract, but it doesn't affect them. It spreads to adults and the adults die. And so they quarantine the kids in a high school, which sounds like a giant nightmare, which I think is the point of this book. A couple of ones just to get into detail. Plague 99 by Jean Urey was published in 1989. I was reading this and I was like, holy crap, this is what we were just going through. And it was from 1989. I think it's supposed to be futuristic from the 99 there, but it's really unclear because there's no date ever given in the actual text. But it's set in London. There's a plague of unknown origin that's airborne. The main characters are Fran and Shahid, which is interesting here because it's 1989 publication date. To see somebody who is an ethnic minority as a main character in a book, and he does get a point of view in this, is really, really nice to see. It's unusual. The plague, in terms of hopefulness, ends with an escape from London and this vague hope for the future. They're leaving this craziness behind, hoping for the better. And then there are two more books in the series that are set 3 generations later, and it's the great-great-grandchildren of these two characters. So we do see that hope is warranted. I haven't read the other 2 in the series, but at least we have that hope, again, which is that fundamental element of children's and YA lit as well as pandemic lit. Scott Westerfeld's Peeps, and if the name sounds familiar, he's the guy who did the Ugly series. This is a vampire book, but vampirism is a parasite in this one, so it's sort of a science fantasy book. And he gives detailed descriptions of real parasitic diseases between the story chapters. So if you want to read this book, and I highly encourage it, it was very good. I recommend not eating while you're doing it. It's a first-person narrative from Cal's perspective. He's 19, so that's a little old, high end of YA. He's a carrier of this parasite, but he's not infected the way most are, but he infects other people. And again, there's this ending that's hopeful because his strain of vampirism is the better one because people are doing better on it than the sort of the newly evolved parasite vampirism. And so there's this hope that by spreading his version of it, that things will get better. So again, this hope for the future, making life better, right? This one's a little bit of a weird one, but it was interesting. Futuristic texts, and these are very popular. So you can see that most of the texts are either historical or futuristic, not surprisingly. What we see with these, I'm not going to read all of the names, but they're often either apocalyptic or dystopian. A lot of these are part of a series, and so sometimes it'll specify the disease, so it's a flu or a prion disease or a hemorrhagic disease. Sometimes it's later, after, several generations after the disease has sort of decimated people and people are trying to recover for it. Sometimes it's something unexpected that's the epidemic. So in the program series, it's suicide that's the epidemic. In another series that I don't have listed here, it's love as the epidemic. So it's interesting to see how that works. Oops, wrong way. The Summer Prince, and I'm not a big dystopian fan as a general rule. This is the fantastic dystopian novel, and it's one of the few by a person of color, about people of color on my list. What you see in this one is it's several hundred years after the apocalyptic events, and there were actually 2. There was a nuclear war, so we have nuclear winter, and then there's a disease that kills off a huge portion of the males in the world. And so you get these 2 narrators, June and Enki, and issues of colorism, classism, and ageism that come in through, and how do you deal with these auntie characters who have taken over and are basically ruining this society in many ways. And so you've got this hope at the ending of stopping this iron control that the aunties have in Palmaris Trace. which is really nice to say. Palmas Trace is the city-state that they live in. And this is the one that has a bit of the compromise in it, because June doesn't want to be queen, and she's queen at the end. But her being queen allows that hope to happen because she is young and she can make changes. And so it's just interesting to see sort of how that that sort of works itself out. So for all of these texts, the key is the hopeful ending. The events of the books are not pleasant by any far stretch of the imagination, but the endings allow readers to believe that there is hope for surviving the pandemic. As Jennifer Brody and Jules Rivera note, dystopian sci-fi serves both comfort to readers that they're not alone, and a roadmap for how to emotionally handle crisis, but most importantly for hope. And so it's this hope that echoes the hope in children's and YA literature more broadly. So hope as the key to this particular, for this particular genre. I think I'm done, so I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to ask for that PowerPoint because I was scribbling the names of those books down, and the summer prints. That's going to be my summer reading. I think it sounds fantastic. So thank you for that, Amy. All right, we have our final presentation tonight, and then we'll have some time for questions afterward, or just chatting because there's so much to chat about here. I think. It's my honor to introduce the multidisciplinary team behind the Pandemic Diaries project, which invited the participation of the SUNY Oneonta community to document their experiences over the last year. Dr. Matthew Henley is professor of history and currently the department chair. Yay him. His specialization is in modern British history, and if you go to the website for WAMC Radio, you can listen to the Academic Minute and hear Dr. Henley's thoughts comparing the US and UK styles of government. Let's say it's not very flattering, but anyway. Ed Beck is the award-winning instructional designer at SUNY Oneonta's Teaching, Learning, and Technology Center. My personal note to faculty from my personal experience is if you have a question about how you can use technology to boost student learning, Ed Beck will have more than one answer that you can actually use. So we should take advantage of him a lot. Darren Chase is the director of the library, which on his Oneonta webpage he describes as a campus third space of learning, distinct from but connected to classroom and home or residence. His research interests include digital humanities, open access, online learning, and information literacy, as well as, and this is cool, research crowdfunding. Ann Trader is adjunct assistant professor of history who has received campus honors for her teaching and has a scholarly interest in historical memory. It's an interest that I'm sure contributed the motivation for the Pandemic Diaries project that this team will talk about tonight. So I hand the mic over to our presenters.
Okay, thanks very much. I will start since I sort of started the project. The project started, not surprisingly, when we all pivoted to online classes last spring. And in the flurry of moving all of my lectures and assignments to an online, non-face-to-face format, I realized that one of my assignments, the very fun map quiz of Europe, was just too low tech to go online. It consisted of a photocopied blank map of Europe. I chose 10 countries randomly for identification. And I thought, how in the world am I going to do that online? And I started madly searching the internet, looking for some kind of customizable map that was not geared for elementary students, you know, color France pink, color Great Britain green. And I was just lamenting that I couldn't do something else, that there was some other assignment that maybe would lend itself to an online format. And I was so frustrated. And then I thought, you know, if this is tough for me, and I have some experience of online teaching, how must the students feel? I mean, what's going through their minds at the moment? And that is the moment when I thought of the diary project. It was like a bolt out of the blue. One of my favorite projects, mass observation, came to my mind. And I thought, why not do my own mass observation? it seemed a perfect time. I could get students to think about what they're experiencing right now, maybe allow them to view themselves as part of something larger, a larger moment, maybe even relieve some of the stress by letting the paper take some of the weight, maybe give them a little extra credit for the class, which never hurts. And so I approached Matthew and I wondered maybe we could open up this idea to all history majors and give them a chance to help create those first person eyewitness narratives that always make for compelling reading. Matthew?
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne. And Anne is, the originator of this, and then it went forward. I have a few words tying it to history, which is appropriate, being that Anne and I are both historians. And just, if this can work, I have a couple little slides to show. Is this projecting? Can you see that slide? Yes? No?
You're good.
Okay, we're good. Okay. So, mass observation in the UK. Both Anne and I were united in our mutual admiration of what, as Anne had referred to, a group called Mass Observation to form the model of this pandemic project. And mass observation was founded in the 1930s by these two men, Charles Madge, who was a surrealist poet on the right, and Tom Harrison, who actually was an amateur bird watcher / anthropologist, who was on the left. And in 1937, they came together, determined to create what they called an anthropology of ourselves, applying anthropological techniques to observing a modern industrialized society. That's the UK. Their methods used both direct observation by a team of observers, and they did self-chronicling by volunteers in diaries, which they called day surveys. Famously, they had a group of 200 volunteer observers who wrote out on the 12th of every month for the year 1937, literally a record of everything they saw, thought, and did. And the idea was that May the 12th, 1937, was the day that King George VI was going to be crowned as king, the coronation, a very big deal, very big, nationwide party. So the idea was to have these records and then to go through them to see how ordinary or extraordinary the day of the coronation truly was. And they published this in a book called May the 12th, first published in 1937. To be honest, the book's a bit of a mess because it's, all of these very rich but rather random observations of that day, but a very interesting start. One of the larger inspirations for mass observation was the belief of the founders that the mass media did not reflect truly the life and experiences of ordinary people. And politicians in the media in the 1930s, during the Depression and the rise of Hitler, often spoke about public opinion in quotes, but they didn't really have an understanding of what the public really thought. So mass observation hoped to fill this gap. They continued issuing day surveys with what were called directives, which were instructions to write on a particular topic to monitor public opinion. And one of the most famous books, which is actually very well put together, unlike May the 12th, was this 1939 book called Britain by Mass Observation. And this provides an almost day-by-day, hour-by-hour account of the Munich crisis, that, where Czechoslovakia was dismembered with a deal between Neville Chamberlain and Hitler and the French premier as well. And it has a lot of other observations about England and social issues, including a rather bizarre chapter about the rise of wrestling in Northern England, which apparently WWF, was a latecomer. This was anticipated years before in Northern England, as observed in this book. Mass observation would continue throughout the Second World War, including the Blitz. They would eventually phase out their day surveys, but they would be revived again in 1981, once the archive moved to the University of Sussex, and they've continued to inspire quite a lot of scholarship. So our inspiration was mass observation, And after speaking with Anne and discussing her initial idea, I began to wonder if we could expand this even larger using modern technologies like a blog, where we could capture and store these historical memories, maybe in a more coherent way than the book May the 12th. And I thought we could expand it to the whole college community. And this is the point I reached out to Darren Chase at the library.
Yeah, this project really captured my imagination. I was excited when Matthew reached out to me. The sense of how the library could meaningfully contribute to this project centers on building and maintaining a collection that is open, accessible, sustainable, and, if digital, interoperable with other systems. Open and accessible because these both match the spirit and intention of a mass observation project, and because an open access solution would have the greatest audience reach and impact. And sustainable because we take the long view in the library, and we want to ensure the long-term viability of the collection and take care to ensure that it continues to be an enriching resource for researchers and scholars for many years. And interoperable with other systems because the potential diversity of materials in the collection would be represented by different platforms or housed in library special collections, and these would have overlapping access points. Also, the collection required a cohering structure that would be able to connect and associate blog diary entries, offline digital entries created in Word, and physical diaries that would be collected and eventually digitized. And of these three material types and the aspects of the project that they represent, it was recognized that the blog entries would likely be the greater part of the collection, and that the immediacy and the bigness of the blog would have the blog representing the entire project. And in considering the question of a blog, I thought of SUNY Create, an initiative which Ed had spearheaded and had at the time recently shared with me. And I knew Ed could, besides spearheading SUNY Create, really contribute a lot to the project, and I quickly reached out to him.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we created SUNY Create in the first place was to have a home for projects like this. I love the digital humanities. I love when we're able to build something quickly that's able to use for students. And so we had this big idea, but it kind of fell to me to kind of figure out how we would do this. Would we connect to the university single sign-in to make it easy, which we eventually did? How would we accept the entries? How do we communicate? What would the user experience be for the students? And so I quickly want to just jump right to what we got. We ended up with over 250 entries by over 100 members of our community, and they were so varied and so different in what they have. And what they were and what the students, faculty members, and staff members were sharing. Some of them were somber. This first one that I've got up on the screen was from a student who went home, and then her entire family, including her grandparents and great-grandparents, got the coronavirus. We had another student who went out and did a whole photo essay, researching, going to her friends, asking them a series of questions that they wanted to ask, and then photographing them from outside their house, through the windows or through the doors of their house, and called the whole photo series From the Outside Looking In. We were dispersed all across New York State. And some of the images that started to come through were just of New York City completely deserted and completely empty, and really emphasized that dichotomy that we were having at the time, which was, especially early in the pandemic, it was something that was happening somewhere else. It was scary, but it was something that was happening somewhere else. We had a return to normalcy. Now all of a sudden we're going to Target again. We're going out, and a staff member shared about when their kid took off their mask at Target and was kind of scolded for misbehaving, and how they reacted and how they did with it. It was a very personal entry that they shared, much more text-based. And I hope what I'm doing by highlighting all these different types of entries is that it became such a multimedia project, with contributions from so many different departments. Sven Anderson, a faculty member, wrote about his plan for sabbatical, how he was going to use his spring semester, and included a piece of his own artwork to include in that. And that was so interesting. In the list of links, we give you all of this student, Gabrielle Bush's, because she kept coming back and kept doing more photo essays over and over again. And so often, especially from this student, they were the little things that have become normal across the pandemic. The image of the key holder next to the front door, and there's the mask on it. That's something that resonated with me. She shared on her 21st birthday and came back to the blog and posted again and told us what it was like to celebrate, a birthday still in the early days of the pandemic. She came back again, and this is the toilet paper aisle, folks. This is something that we don't have to deal with anymore. But I mean, it really goes through, and you see different time periods of the pandemic and how that changed for us. And it was just so wonderful to be able to just enable this in some way. The Spanish department got really creative, started challenging their students to do bilingual posts on the pandemic diaries. And so we have some text posts that were bilingual, and those were really interesting to see and read. We had a whole telenovela scripted and then uploaded to the pandemic diaries. It's available on YouTube and right on our website. We shared about Halloween, and this is another staff member who just talked about, again, months and months later, different time period of the pandemic, and you see how these posts change over time in what we see and what we're looking at. And it's really amazing and interesting to see the different reactions that our students have had. This student, and this struck me, skipped the last day of school, skipped the last day of her senior year of high school, and wrote about that, and wrote how she wished she hadn't. I wish I hadn't gone on that college visit. I wish I had, done my last day in high school. That was a mistake looking back at it. And then, just to tie back to Amy's talk, we do see hope, and we've seen it a couple times. I believe Marie Montoya is on this call, so I'll embarrass her by calling her out. She wrote that hopeful entry. It's time to go back to the classroom. I'm going back. And we see that throughout the pandemic diaries as well. It's made it a wonderful project to work on. I believe Darren put in the chat the links to all of the original posts I just highlighted. There's so many more. I hope that you go and check them out and see them on the site.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. All three of these presentations are so great, and I was jotting all kinds of things down. I wrote only a few posts, but I remember scrolling through some other posts in the pandemic diaries, and some of them just really break your heart, right? I mean, as well as some of them are just hilarious, and like the whole range, right? So it's pretty amazing that you were able to do this project, and involve all of us in it.
Now, so you did contribute, right?
Yeah, I did do that.
Do you owe me a contributor form?
I sent you. I got the thing through Adobe.
The big thing that happened most recently is we presented at a digital humanities conference within SUNY, which the SUNY Press director was there. And so SUNY Press contacted the editorial team, and we're going to publish it in a open access book with SUNY Press, including some of the historical information and contextual information that we presented today. So it's the next evolution of the Pandemic Diaries. But we need your contributor release forms.
I signed mine. I swear I did. Yeah, now's the time to open up to follow up on questions or have a conversation. I feel like there's just a lot to say here. I see some really interesting connections across these 3 projects. So I'm going to stop talking and let others chime in. Oh, I guess Doug and I should say that please go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. So.
I'll make a comment. I had the privilege and honor of being a little bit involved in the PPE project that Scott and Matt opened this webinar talking about, and my role was really just to try to pull together some resources so we could buy more materials. But I just want to underscore how incredibly well organized they were, and what an amazing thing it was to go to Goodrich Theater and to see the operation that they created there. It was so beautifully organized. There was such attention to detail. I've just found the whole thing overwhelming, but in a good way, with just how capable and how much talent and how much just real love for community was coming through there. And I noted in the chat that that PPE that Scott and Matt and all those volunteers made probably saved lives. And but not only that, I think it was a huge project for the volunteers, and really an important thing. Even for myself at that time, the museum was closed. I was working remotely, but doing what? We were just beginning to figure out virtual programming like tonight's webinar, and to be able to help out with their PPE project gave us something to focus on during a really bleak time. There's a lot we can draw from their experience. The fact that these supplies were so needed, that theater departments and people with 3D printers and sewing machines in their living rooms were needed to meet a national need, is both inspiring from the point of view of the community, but also damning of our national preparedness system or lack thereof. But I think for everybody involved in that project, it was, I think it provided a really important focal point during a rough time, and was a real way that we could express our care for the wider community. So my hat's off to both of them for what they did, and they're very modest, but what they did was truly incredible, and it gave me a totally new appreciation for the skills and aptitudes that theater as a academic, as a subject, as an endeavor, actually is teaching our students, in producing these fictional worlds on stage. They're also learning real world skills that tweaked can actually save lives when needed. And those are real life skills. So there's a bunch of messages there, but I just wanted to say those things. So thank you.
Sally, could I just piggyback off that? This is Tim Newton from Music. I just want to say, I'm on my phone, so it's awkward, but I just want to say I echo all of that. And I've worked with Matt and Scott in productions, and I am so impressed by their artistic creativity under pressure, on a dime, turning the corner and creating what they did. And their space is so humble compared to what most theater programs have. They make such a small space so effective, and they do this all year with multiple productions. And I've watched them work. I'm amazed at my colleagues, and I would say that for all of the presentations tonight. They're so impressive. Our little university here on the Hill is in that sense really underrated. But I just have to give a shout out to Scott and Matt for all that they have done and for what they continue to do in their regular jobs as theater technicians and theater designers and things. It's truly remarkable. So thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Tim. You're going to make me blush.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me? Okay. I have a question for Matt and Scott as well, as one of several historians in the room, and that is, did you keep a few of your gowns and masks as historical artifacts? Have you held back a few to donate either to our special collections in the library, or if they don't want to deal with something that's not literary text? The Cooperstown graduate program has a material culture collection. It'd be really cool, if you had any patterns left or anything else, that you could preserve them. So in decades in the future, they can pull them out of a drawer and say, remember when? It would be a great, entree into rethinking the historical moment.
I know we've got, we definitely have some masks sitting around because those are still being produced. Matt, I don't know if you've got any of the face shield frames. There might actually be, we had some gowns that were not quite up to factory specs. So I don't think those got shipped off. So we may have, and we still have all the templates. We hung on to all that stuff just in case we had to ramp up production again. So we do have some of the artifacts from that endeavor kicking around.
One other thing we have, and yeah, it's definitely like Scott just said, we definitely have some stuff still around that could be saved in that way. But one thing we also have is the poster that was on the wall in the PPE area that documented all of the production day by day, that we kept track of what we made each day. We have a big document on the wall that actually I might even be able to share a picture of it with you, that was sort of what we were using for everyone to rally around and kind of see what progress we were making. I'll just share the picture right here with you. You can see it. Can you see that?
Became a motivator to see if we could beat our previous records.
Mm-hmm.
So we kept track of everything we were making and where we were sending it and that sort of thing. And so yeah, it'd be kind of cool if wherever, let us know where we can provide that sort of thing, and we'd be happy to. And just to comment on what Doug and Tim said, we definitely appreciate the praise, and to add to what Doug said, there certainly was, I think, for everybody on these projects, a selfish component of just trying to do something and deal with the situation that we were in. And I think doing something productive in our fields, our areas of expertise, certainly helped us move forward and helped other people as well. So.
I just, it's Sally again. I just want to, so one thing I was thinking about as everyone was talking is that it just seems like, I was thinking about the theme of hope that Amy was introducing from the literature, and how like it's not about, I love that, like, because I remember reading Tuck Everlasting with my kids, and it is indeed not a sugar-coated happy ending, and yet there's something very resonant about that. And actually the best books from my youth are those books that were not necessarily straightforward, like everyone ended up happily ever after. It was these ones that you weren't certain where the future was going to go, but you knew they had a future and they had something. And I feel like the PPE project, the diaries project, and these books that you're describing, and the very fact that all of us individually felt like we had to engage. Like I definitely have felt like, so I've been on sabbatical, and so organizing these talks with Doug, or getting involved in research with like Alex Thomas in sociology, right? Like these things have frankly been like survival for me, because I needed to feel like I could do something in this time. That's part of where the hope was coming out of, right? Is like, okay, this project needs me to do something and I can do it. That was hope. That was enough to keep going on when stuff was not looking good, especially this time last year. So I just think it's so interesting that in our own ways, like what Matt was saying before, like finding some way to use what we already knew how to do and doing something with it that connected us back with other people, how important that is. So I don't know, somebody else can say something now.
Well, if I may, I won't turn on my camera because it's kind of late and then I'm not in shape, but I can talk. I think the pandemic diaries for me was a way to keep connected to campus. It was, I have been feeling very isolated. I don't use social media at all. And I always thought that the pandemic diaries gave me a space to tell the moments that were important, like the first day of class. I'm teaching online, the first day in the fall semester, when Biden won elections. I wanted to tell the world I'm proud of being a naturalized citizen. And then one day, and usually with the pandemic diaries, I'm just at home thinking, what is the next step? I'm coming back. I don't want to be in my house anymore. I don't want to be teaching sitting down. I don't want to be just looking at my students through this laptop. And I want to tell my colleagues, I want to tell the world through the pandemic diaries. And I think that created a space for me to stay on campus. I miss campus, and I like to, I miss my colleagues, and I think the pandemic diaries gives me that opportunity. So that's why I participate, and I want to keep participating.
Could I make a comment about Amy's talk? I'm curious about the popularity of some of these books that are on the list, and also that that the endings offer comfort, as if I have her statement correctly, offer comfort to readers that people are not alone, and also that a roadmap is offered for emotional coping. I was a junior high school librarian for almost 7 years, and it always amazed me that the books that had the most dire circumstances tended to be the most popular. This was my first job. I was about 23. And, you know, what you said tonight makes so much sense when I think about what students were grasping for at the ages of 11, 12, 13, 14. And so, you know, as I thought about those books, now granted, we're in a pandemic now, but, you know, pandemic situation, dire situations do seem to, when presented in books, have a great deal of appeal to help young people through crises. But it took me a long time to understand why, because, you know, many of the books that were, I would say, much more lighthearted, I don't know that I'd say happy endings, but, you know, at that time, it was a very serious drug problem for young people. And I lived in a community that was partly university families, rural families, Black families, and immigrant families coming from Cambodia and Vietnam. And there were a lot of problems for young people, alcohol, LSD, this kind of thing. So there were a lot of crisis situations among those children. And so when I think about these books about pandemics, similar crises, I begin to think about that appeal for them in terms of helping them get through those difficult times. So I appreciate that critique of those books, because I have not really ever studied children's literature, and it brings some points out to me that I hadn't thought about. So thank you, Amy.
Thanks. Yeah, well, and if you think about it, dystopian literature was hugely popular. I mean, Suzanne Collins, and for a while, I mean, it's starting to wane a little bit, although there's a question if it's going to wave back. But I mean, it's all about climate change and government problems and that sort of thing. And these are things that make kids anxious. And these books are dealing with it's bibliotherapy. That's exactly what it is, and it's a way to cope. And that's why we see all the picture books now coming out. And yes, a lot of them are self-published, but it's helping to explain to kids who don't understand the coronavirus what it is that's going on. And so, again, bibliotherapy is so important.
Amy, I just love this term bibliotherapy. I mean, it's really resonating with me. So you just have to register that. It's powerful.
I just want to briefly chime in with something I'm realizing that I'm thinking that I haven't thought yet throughout this whole pandemic, in that tonight has given us the opportunity to be sort of meta-reflective. We're looking at these moments of reflection with an even further step away. And that is such an exciting feeling. And it feels very much like I can, feel the rays of the light at the end of the tunnel finally starting to actually reach me. So I'm so grateful to have had this space to have that realization.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I mean, I'm grateful for this moment too. It's been the best part of my wellness day, by far. Yeah, Michelle makes a great point. Writing in the diary was a great therapy as well. Don't have a catchy term for it. I know, really, wasn't it? I mean, writing in the diary, reading the diary, and feeling like I was learning things about colleagues and people I didn't know on campus, but who I knew were members of the campus community, and I'm a part of the campus community. It made me feel closer and more connected to the campus. It made me really understand this was a shared experience. The diversity of experiences that were being described and are described in the diary aside, that there was the greater shared experience that we were having that was the glue. Yeah.
And if I can mention too, I encouraged, and Ann did as well, our students to participate in that. And it was really fascinating to see the reaction of history students when you tell them, when it was in the blog, but then when we told them that this would be a book, that we said, you are now becoming a part of history. Someone might make a footnote about you. And, some of the students were sort of initially dumbfounded and then really excited about that concept. Because historians and their sources, we're a strange bunch. And when you've become a source yourself, it makes your story matter. It's not just an atomized feeling. It's, now something that will be shared in the future and forevermore, comes a building block of a bigger narrative. I mean, that's a really empowering feeling, I think, especially for a young student. undergraduate that's trying to figure out what on earth's going on in their life, in the world. So I thought that was really cool, being able to deliver that message to my students that participated in Club.
Yeah, I think too, my students who did it as well, some of them did it almost for the whole year of 2020. They participated in the spring and continued in the fall. And I was most gratified when they said, I went back and reread the person that I was in the spring, and I'm a very different person now. And it's really interesting for me to see how I grew throughout that whole time. And the things that really upset me a year ago now seem so very foolish, and I feel like a much better person now. That to me was very gratifying.
I had sort of an observation about the Pandemic Diary project. The fact that you were so successful and that you created this platform and got such wonderful, participation and really, it really seemed to resonate with so many people, I think is really, really interesting. In that we usually think of today as being so sort of saturated with opportunities to broadcast, right, to publish, right? You put whatever, you put how you're feeling this minute on Facebook or tweet 700 times a day. But it just goes to show that, like, for all that, for all the social media development that there's been, there's a lot of people talking apparently, but not a lot of people listening. But when you create a space in this, like you did in this project, and people feel like their stories are being read or listened to or observed, and they feel heard, they feel seen, right? That's so powerful to make people feel or help them feel like what they are experiencing is legitimate, is important, is unique, at the same time that it's universal. I think like that's really, really powerful stuff. And I just it's always been something in my my many kind of phases of my careers that I've always like really, really believed in is when you sort of give people the ability to or the license to kind of create knowledge, you get these really, really powerful things. So I just think it's a fantastic project, and yeah, just wanted to say that.
And sorry to chime in again, but I mean, one thing I think was enriching about the project that maybe differentiates itself from these social media alternatives is there's a big development of really an element, pardon me, of reflection in these pieces. They're not instantaneous. It's not, here's my selfie, you think about it for 10 seconds, or, I'm angry because someone's butting in line. I mean, a lot of people really sat back, they thought, and because the team and Ed's and Darren's really well thought out way of creating this platform, people could do poetry, they could do photography, they could have a narrative, they could have an entry for a day, a week. It really made people, I think, pause and absorb and think before writing down. And that's something sorely lacking in so much of our reactive social media culture. So it's sort of like a cleansing, cathartic feeling to do this. And even reading them, you get that as you go through them. It's really a genuine thing.
Yeah, I just want to so I don't know if you're seeing it, what Maria just wrote in the chat. The pandemic diaries kept us unified as a community. Oneonta needed to feel that sense of community to recover from the fall closure. And I think that's so, yeah, like I like that word recover. Like people were traumatized, right? And hurt. We were hurt, and we need, so finding some sort of recovery through the writing of this collective document. It's really kind of, yeah, I guess that's how we do that, right? Something collectively. So I'm realizing it's 8:30 and we've been on here a while, and I feel like we could keep talking, and I love that we're connecting. Maybe part of there's a hunger here to hang around and see each other and spend time. And if this was normal times, I would be like, hey guys, let's go down to Roots now, right? So I'm hoping that after this, when it's normal times, let's go to Roots together and sit down together. So thank you everyone for being part of this. I feel really my heart feels very full, which is a funny thing to say in an academic environment, but I genuinely feel that. So.
I think that is a really fitting way to end tonight, and I just want to thank you all for participating as presenters or as audience members. Thank you for this conversation, and I didn't expect tonight's webinar to be something that was healing, but it was, and what a wonderful sort of serendipitous and amazing thing. So thank you all so much. We will get this up onto YouTube in the next couple of days, and you'll be able to find it on the Science Discovery Center's channel.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
That's good.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.
Have a good night.
Bye. Have a good night, everybody.